Welcome, Tony, to Every Other Right.
Well, thank
And
you.
thanks so
Good
much
to
for
be here.
doing this. I really enjoy your channel. And I felt a connection because we're both dedicating to telling it like it is and not necessarily how our audience wants to hear it.
All right. I mean, if you don't have integrity, if your actions aren't integrated with your values, then that people are never going to listen. So I just, like you say, tell it like it is.
One thing I want to tell people up front here is whether you think Karen Reed is guilty or not, we should all be able to agree that a murder investigation should be professional, impartial, and thorough.
Yes,
And what happened here was
absolutely.
none of those things. And that should
Not
scare
a
everybody.
bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're going to focus today on what's clearly an incompetent police department
Yes.
and possibly a corrupt one.
I agree with you completely that any murder investigation, frankly, any investigation, whether it's burglary or murder, should be conducted in a professional manner. You should follow the evidence, and it shouldn't be like Stalin said, you find me the man, I'll find you the crime. And I think that's what they did with Karen Reed. They found Karen Reed and said, this would make a good patsy.
So I suspect nothing we're going to say today would be any different if Karen Reed turns out to be innocent or guilty, because we're talking about the investigation. And
Yes,
everybody deserves a fair investigation.
they do.
And for people who think that Karen Reed is guilty, they should be really pissed at
Yeah,
this police department.
they certainly should. One of the things that I would be upset with if I really truly believed she was guilty is the fact that they didn't go in and search the house because they gave the defense a huge opening there.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one of the
Absolutely.
commenters on my channel, and I thought this was really, really prescient, he said, somehow I think that if they found a dead cop on my lawn, that they would come into my house and search it. I thought,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It's so
that's
incredible.
probably true.
I would have to twist circumstances to have the right to search Brian Albert's house. We had no reason, and there's been no reason since.
How about this? How about this? There's a dead guy on the lawn that looked like he potentially could have been in a physical altercation. How about that? Might that be of some concern to go inside the house and see if there was a struggle that started in the house?
There's still no evidence to go into the house.
You have a guy that's out on the lawn with no coat on. You think the coat might be inside the house? That might be a reasonable assumption? Yes or no?
No.
And part of my challenge, even talking about this topic, is I just become incoherent because I'm like, I can't freaking believe that.
Yeah.
So, with
Hear
all
you.
that, let's pull back a bit and you tell us about your background.
All right. Well, I went to high school in the Philippines. After that, I became a U.S. Army combat medic. Did that for a couple of
Wow.
years. I got out of that field and became a registered respiratory therapist. I was a respiratory therapist. I worked in Florida, Ohio, Missouri, Illinois, a lot of different
Wow.
places for 13 years. Worked as a manager, and I decided that it was just not my calling. My calling was
I have
to
to
go
tell
be
you,
an
I used to
attorney.
work in a hospital environment, and the most depressed people who hated their job the most were the respiratory therapists.
Yeah. And respiratory therapists do sort of have a reputation in many hospitals as being just a half a bubble off. But to me, I loved the work. I love taking care of patients. I just didn't like dealing with the nonsense that came out of the hospital administration. I always thought that a nonprofit hospital should be, I don't know, nonprofit, but a lot of people don't think that. So I did that for 13 years. Then I went to law school at age 35.
Wow.
When I got out, I clerked for the Missouri Supreme Court for a year, and then I spent 30 years trying cases and handling appeals in Missouri until last year in July when the law firm said, we really need to cut some expenses and you're one. So we need to let you retire. So they retired me, and that's what I did. I I had the YouTube channel already, and I thought, well,
Oh,
I'm
okay.
going to devote more time to that. That's what I've done.
So, have you ever handled a case resembling anything like Karen Reed? Or like what kind of cases did you do?
A lot of the cases that I had primary responsibility for dealt with insurance questions on appeal. Um, we changed the law in Missouri on workers' comp cases. We changed the law on. Uh, we had a really interesting series of cases that dealt with a guy who had welded a pressure tank on a cement truck and it exploded. It was an explosive decompression and it really terribly hurt this guy. And we got good verdicts, or we got good results. And as a result, the insurance company that defended the guy wound up going out of business in Missouri. So I felt pretty good about that. Any day that an insurance company goes out of business, you should run that in the news as good news today. But that I did a lot of those. The only case that I had that's even anywhere like this one, we were an appellate counsel for a sheriff's deputy, and he was charged with burglary because of the way he entered a trailer where a known meth head was, who was in the process of cooking meth, and the local people. It was completely political, and we were able to get the Supreme Court to reverse that conviction. So, that's really the only thing I've seen that was anywhere close to this. And St. Louis City has something of a reputation very similar to Boston in terms of problems with their police department, but nowhere to the level that you're seeing in this Karen Reed case. It's disgusting.
So you had told me you didn't cover it the first time around. When did you get into this?
I got interested in it after when it first came out that it had been mistried. And the thing that interested me about that was that the jury was ready to come back with verdicts on 2 of the counts, but they were hung up on 1 of the counts. So the right thing for the judge to do, in my opinion, would have been to let the jury deliver their verdicts on the 2 counts that they could agree on, and then mistry the 3rd count, so you can always retry that later. But that's not what she did. And it went up on appeal. I'm not sure that it was I don't think it was fair, frankly, but they mistried all 3, and now we're back doing it. Well, it's hard for somebody who's guilty to ever get a hung jury, because usually the state, or the Commonwealth in this case, has amassed enough evidence to get over that hurdle of reasonable doubt. When they came back and they indicated that they had 2 acquittals and that it was a hung jury, that piqued my interest. And then when I started looking into some of the facts of the case, and this Trooper Proctor thing came up where they wound up firing him, I thought, there's no way they'll retry this case. And of course, I was proved wrong. Hank Brennan came in.
There's so many more reasons too, but let's talk about Bev. I was going to talk about her later, but so Bev is the judge.
Yes.
And I think at least people who are supportive of Karen Reed feel that she's putting her finger on the scales.
I think that's true.
In her big decisions, she usually does the right thing. But on day to day, she does whatever she can to hurt the defense.
That is absolutely correct. And I'll tell you one thing that has really annoyed me. Now, obviously, court rules are different in every state, but in Missouri, if you rise from your chair in trial and say objection, the judge looks at you until you finish that statement. Objection, hearsay, objection, incompetent, no foundation, whatever it is. Hank Brennan says objection, and she immediately rules sustained. And of course, on the other side,
did you know she has a rule? You're not allowed to say what the objection is.
Yeah,
and I have no idea why. I mean, what could be the purpose?
Well, one purpose is, it depends again on the appellate rules in the state, but in Missouri, if you fail to get an objection ruled upon, it's deemed to be essentially waived. So if you don't start if you don't state the basis for your objection and you just make it objection, then any basis upon which that objection could have been ruled upon that supports the exclusion of that evidence comes into play. So an appellate court can say, well, she must have thought that it was hearsay, or she must have thought that it was this or that. It allows the appellate court to speculate. And so that's how you sustain bad verdicts, is you don't make a good record of why you are overruling a particular objection. And apparently she doesn't allow them to argue the objections on sidebars unless her feathers get ruffled, which again I think is just another way of putting your thumb on the scale. And it doesn't make any sense to me why you would not want the basis. And again, it doesn't have to be the factual basis. You can say things like objection hearsay, objection foundation, and the jury doesn't have any idea what you're talking about, but the judge does. What you want to avoid, of course, and a lot of courts in Missouri do this, they say no speaking objections. And that's when somebody gets up and says, Your Honor, that's ridiculous. He never said that. Instead of saying, it's assumes facts, not evidence, they get up and they make this long-winded speech, which is essentially them talking to the jury. So that's a legitimate basis for reining it in, but you have to have some kind of basis for an objection, and she's not giving them any chance to do that.
Well, it fits my theory that she's both trying to put her finger on the scale and preserve for appeal.
Right.
And, I thought one of the big ones there, it gets into stuff we can't fully explain right now, but the FBI hired this organization called ARCA and got them to recreate the events of that night without knowing anything about it. They didn't know who the people were. They didn't know the case, et cetera. The FBI just said, we want you, with no information whatsoever, to tell us what could have happened here.
Right.
And they were devastating witnesses in the first trial. And she wanted them out. She clearly wanted them out. And she gave the new prosecutor. So in the first trial, there was a very ineffective prosecutor who made a lot of really bad decisions. And they hired a new prosecutor for the second trial because they wanted to do better.
Yeah, and they're paying him $225,000.
Yeah, and he wanted to get ARCA out because ARCA is, the worst case, because these are serious scientists who are saying there's no car collision. If there's no car collision, there's no case.
Right.
So she opened it up and made it clear that she was going to allow the prosecutor in, this is outside of the jury, but in terms of deciding whether or not to bring in ARCA, she was going to allow the prosecutor to be as tough as he wanted. She wasn't going to put any barriers on him, right? And he got nothing.
Yep.
And she had, because again, I think she wants to preserve the appeal process, she had to let ARCA in because they gave her nothing on which to reject them.
Yeah.
And I thought that was pretty amazing.
That is, I think, just amazing that, you would have the, I saw that voir dire of that expert, and I couldn't believe what they were doing to that guy. But you're right, they went after him pretty hard and they got nothing. And the reason they got nothing is there's nothing to get.
Well, they wanted to say, oh, you had communications on Signal, which is a secure system, so we have no idea what you were talking about. But you know what lawyers do all the time is that, they have a phone call, so there's no record of the discussion.
That's exactly right.
There's nothing suspicious about using Signal.
No. And in fact, we always told our experts, when you get to the end of this case and you've reviewed all of the medical records and all the other things, all the depositions, call me and tell me what your opinion is. Because if they send you a letter, then you're going to be stuck with that, even if you can get them to adjust it later on. And a lot of times they haven't fully considered because they haven't been on the ground, they haven't seen the actual location. A lot of times they'll overlook things, and you may want to point that out so that you wind up getting a better report at the end by virtue of having had an opportunity to visit with them. And in this case, they just, they didn't do that. And the experts, and at the first trial, the experts were essentially offered by the FBI, and they were originally hired by them. They're going to do, it's against the law to lie to the FBI. So, those scientists were absolutely clear about everything that they did. And I think that's exactly why they were such devastating witnesses.
To finish up with Bev, I thought the absolute worst thing for her was at that end of that trial, you referenced it, the jury did not understand how they needed to fill out the forms. They had a misunderstanding that if they were not in agreement on every single charge, that they were not in agreement on anything, which was not true.
Right.
This happens all the time, right? Juries don't know their job. They don't know how to do it. In the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, they came back with incorrect things, and the judge did his job, and he looked through the paperwork, and he said, you got this wrong. Go back and fix it.
Right.
And bring it back. If she had simply said, you didn't indicate which things that you agreed on and which things you didn't, and sent them back, Karen Reed would have been found innocent on 2 charges.
She would have.
And no, it's not even possible that in Massachusetts that they would have brought it forward on the 3rd charge.
No, I don't think so.
So she alone caused all of this.
Yeah, I had a case very similar to that. It was a group of teachers in Jefferson City who were suing the school district because they had hired 2 principals who decided to get rid of the old dead wood, and they targeted any teacher over 40. And they wound up getting 2 of them fired, and we wound up getting a verdict. But the first time they came back with the verdict, it was inconsistent. They had not awarded actual damages, but they did award punitive damages. So the judge told them their verdict was inconsistent, told them to see if they could figure out how to make the jury verdict form make sense. So they went back and they did that, and then we got a good verdict. It's normal to do that. What isn't normal is to say, well, the heck with it. We'll just retry the case.
Court of the session, please be seated.
All right, Mr. Foreman, I am in receipt of your note. Judge Cannoni, despite our rigorous efforts, we continue to find ourselves at an impasse. Our perspectives on the evidence are starkly divided. Some members of the jury firmly believe that the evidence surpasses the burden of proof, establishing the elements of the charges beyond a reasonable doubt. Conversely, others find the evidence fails to meet this standard and does not sufficiently establish the necessary elements of the charges. The deep division is not due to a lack of effort or diligence, but rather a sincere adherence to our individual principles and moral convictions. To continue to deliberate would be futile and only serve to force us to compromise these deeply held beliefs. I'm not going to do that to you folks. Your service is complete. I'm declaring a mistrial in this case.
Yeah, she's being subjected to, what's the term? The double jeopardy.
Well, it's not
which
really
is one of
double
our most
jeopardy
fundamental
because they didn't
rights.
reach a verdict. If they had recorded the verdict, it'd be double jeopardy.
Yes.
But they didn't.
Yeah, so if she had done her job, they would have recorded it, and then it would now
Yes.
be double jeopardy. And we haven't even got to the police department yet.
Yeah, I know.
So let's talk about the Massachusetts State Police. And I've just
Where
been
do they
shocked.
hire these guys from?
I watch hundreds and hundreds of these YouTube videos, and traffic stops and court cases and all this, and I have
I do
so
that
much
too.
respect for the cops
Mm-hmm.
because I've seen over and over again perfectly innocent situation. They walk up to a car, the person pulls out a gun and shoots them.
Yep,
It's an amazing job to have to do.
it is.
And watching these people, I mean, have you ever encountered anything close to this?
No, well, no. I mean, only once. In St. Louis, I had a client who was going to go to a ball game downtown, and he got ready to cross the street. He wasn't in a crosswalk. And the cop yelled at him, told him to get back on the street. So the guy, being stupid, just kind of evil-eyed the cop. Just kind of gave him a short shrift with his gaze. He didn't say anything. Cop walked over, charged him with failure to obey a lawful order, arrested him, and then when he was walking him into the police station, he ran his head right into the door frame, busted up his head.
Mm-hmm.
So we filed an internal affairs charge, and I entered to defend the criminal case, that just a misdemeanor, but you don't want to be charged with disobeying a lawful order. As soon as the internal affairs investigation was started, the prosecutor called me and said, if I dropped the IA charge, that they drop the criminal charge. And of course, my client said, yeah, I'd like that. So he didn't follow up on it, but it was very clear that cop was out of line, and the district attorney's job is not to bat cleanup for the people who are, doing the actual policing. Their job is to go after the criminals, and that deal was a corrupt deal, in my opinion. So in that respect, it's a little bit like what's going on here, but here you've got somebody who is, I think he has to know, I think Brennan has to know this was a terribly incompetent and corrupt investigation, but he's putting it forward anyway.
And Brennan is the new prosecutor, yeah. Well, yeah. I have a theory that this department is set up to support corruption because they don't follow any of the modern policing methodologies of the last 20, 50 years.
Right.
They don't film their interviews.
No.
In fact, that's not true. They don't film the interview if they like the person.
Yeah.
They do film the interview if they're going to want to try to go after them.
Right.
So what does that mean after the fact? They get to say whatever they want about what was in that interview.
That's right. And, there are so many things that are wrong about this. Somebody asked me in a comment the other day, what would I do? What would I have expected? They were in the middle of a nor'easter, Well, crime happens when it snows too. I mean, it just does. So they asked me, what about that? And anybody who's ever watched CSI or CSI Miami knows exactly what they should have done. They should have cordoned off the crime scene, should have entered the residence, they should have interviewed everybody who was there, they should have interviewed anybody who had left the residence at any point between midnight and 6 a.m. They would have done a search inside the residence for anything that might have been in contact with John O'Keefe. They'd have fingerprinted surfaces of the doors and other places he might have touched. They would have looked for blood. They probably would have used fluorescein to see if any blood had been cleaned up. Outside, they would have photographed the body where it lay. They would have had the medical examiner remove it. It was fairly clear at the point that they called the paramedics that Mr. O'Keefe was no longer with us. Allowing him to go to the hospital simply messed up the crime scene. But if you wanted to preserve the crime scene, you cordon it off and then you grid it. You take ropes and you grid the crime scene, and then you take a space heater and you use the space heater to melt the snow in that area so that anything that's on top of the snow or buried underneath the snow essentially comes up to the surface. And they didn't do that. I mean, all of these things are things that anybody who has worked in the snow in a crime scene would have done. They wouldn't have used a snowblower, and they wouldn't have collected things in solo cups, which, I mean, it's almost like somebody said, if we were to go out and hire the most incompetent crime scene people in the free world, how would they handle this investigation? Somebody said, oh, I know, solo cups. And it's just, I can't
to give anyone who doesn't know the basics some context. So the theory of the prosecution is that Karen Reed was very, very mad at her boyfriend.
Yes.
And she took him, so they'd been at a couple of bars with a whole bunch of cops, because he was a cop. And after the bars closed, the party was going to continue at this house. So they go to this house. He gets out of the SUV. She's very angry at him, even though all the video up to them shows them being very nice to each other, very loving to each other, etc.
Mm-hmm.
She's so mad at him, she puts her SUV in reverse, goes 25 miles an hour, hits him, he flies across the lawn, and he's killed. And she just drives off. So that's the theory of the prosecution, right? And then all the things you talked about. So they did not secure the crime scene. They did not put up crime scene tape around the lawn.
Right.
They did not have people there to make sure that nobody corrupted the scene. They did not take one photo. Unimaginable. You have a dead guy on the line. You didn't take a photo. Nobody knows where his body was.
No. It's ridiculous.
Then he was taken to the hospital, and everything after that, when you're trying to say, where did the car hit him, where did he fly, you don't know, because you don't know where his body was. It's
and
right
that's
there,
a feature
reasonable
for the
doubt.
prosecution, not a bug.
Right. Right. And then the really bizarre thing, which is related to what you're talking about, was they allege that when she hit him, the taillight smashed into a gazillion pieces.
Right.
Now, first of all, she hit him hard enough to do that to a taillight, which is basically impossible for a body part to do because a taillight is very, very tough. But then it smashed into a gazillion pieces that went all over the lawn. But they couldn't find a single one of them that night.
That's right.
Or the next day. Until they took her car into possession. And then all of a sudden, taillight pieces started showing up everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody'd seen them.
Yeah.
And these are red lights against the snow.
Yeah. And that does not make any sense to me at all. The issue for me on that score is, like I said, I was a respiratory therapist for 13 years. I spent a lot of time in emergency rooms. I've seen people been hit by cars. And generally speaking, if you were hit by a car going 25 miles an hour and it hits you on the arm, which is what they claim, these two bones are going to be broken in at least one place and sometimes more. No bones broken, no bruising.
There's not a
Just
bruise. There's not a
scratches.
broken bone. Nothing below his neck other
Right.
than some scratches on his arms, which is controversial. Yeah, so just incredible. But to even make that worse, right, that's not enough. The supervisor of all this, Buchanan, which we're going to get to, tells his cops, for the next few weeks, on your way to work, drive by this lawn, and if you see a piece of taillight, go pick it up.
Yeah.
The scene is no longer secured. They've already searched it 3 times, and they can't find these red taillights. And for weeks later, the cops are randomly finding taillights, not a single piece of which was marked for where it was found.
Right. And,
I mean,
here's
this
the
is
other
where I
thing
just like,
about that. You know, they didn't secure the Sally port, so and the video was cut off in the Sally port. There, you couldn't get a more screwed up situation than this. And one of the people that the defense claims is primarily responsible for the injuries to O'Keefe was in the Sally port that night. And then when you look at the tail light, there's no blood or hair or fiber buried in the tail
Or
light.
DNA. Yep.
They find 2 little hairs on the car. Well, those were either planted or they are the most indefatigable hairs in the world, because if you're just driving down the road, the wind's going to blow those off. So again, it makes it look to me
Right.
like they were planted.
Well, not only that, they went after the car because once they decided this was a car collision, right?
Mhm.
They didn't take a photo of the car when they picked it up. They never took a photo of the taillight. And they had no warrant for the car. It's, its own issue. But that's just incredible. This is your murder weapon, and the taillight is your proof of the collision, and you don't take a single photo.
Yep. Again, that gets back to what you said. about if you really believe she's guilty, you ought to be more annoyed with them than with Karen Reed.
Yeah.
Or at least there are a lot of people saying ugly things about Alan Jackson, about how he's annoying, but the only reason he was annoying in any of those questionings was because the other people were fighting him. You know, if you ask him, does the sun come up in the east, they're going to say, well, what do you mean by east? I mean, it's crazy stuff like that. Yeah, that I don't think that
he's a
ever
defense
works.
lawyer.
Mm-hmm. It's his job.
Well, one of the things, well, let's talk about this before we get into some of the other details. I've been mystified by is that you have all these people in here who really, really want Karen Reed to be found guilty, the witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And they've had years to prepare. They've already been through one trial.
Yeah.
I just can't understand their strategy. So, for example, Jennifer McCabe, right? Federal agents came to her house to interview her. And she said, give me 10 minutes. I need to fix my hair and brush my teeth.
Yeah.
And during that 10 minutes, she calls 5 people.
Yeah.
They then ask her, before we came in here, who did you call? She admits to 2 people. Then, and it's clear, and Jackson did a really good at laying this out, after she terminated the interview, she said, I don't want to do this interview anymore, which doesn't look great for her. It's clear her husband told her, they just said that lying to them was a crime, and you didn't tell them who all you talked to. So she then calls them and says, I just remembered. I mean, this is half an hour ago, but I forgot in between. There's 2 more people I called. And she still left out Brian Albert, one of the key people in this case. She did not tell them, even then, that she had called him.
Yeah.
What's mystifying to me is that, first of all, they know they're going to get uncovered and cross. They've been through all this. They've had time to think about it. They didn't come up, none of these witnesses came up with some reasonable excuse. She just sits there saying, well, I forgot.
Yeah, or I'm just a simple mom. I'm just a mom.
Yeah.
That's all I am. Nobody believes that.
So I'm not going to focus on her too much because she isn't part of the police force.
No. But you're right. Those witnesses had a lot of time to come up with believable scenarios, and they didn't.
Well, I will say, okay, this in her case. One of the bizarre things in this case is around the time that John O'Keefe died, all these butt dials started happening between everybody in the house. None of them actually called each other, but their butts were calling each other.
Yeah.
And answering.
Yeah.
And I thought she could have said, because she had, at one point, 7 butt dials in a row.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if anybody who has an iPhone or an Android, I can't even remember ever having a butt dial. As Jackson pointed out, there's 7 steps involved to make a phone call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She could
You
have
don't
said,
butt dial on an iPhone.
She could have said, something weird was happening with my phone that week, like maybe water had gotten into it or something, and it kept calling people. She could have come up with something. But she just said, no, 7 times it butt dialed.
Nobody believes that, I hope.
So let's talk about the Proctor factor. Can you tell people about Michael Proctor?
Michael Proctor was the lead investigator, although Buchanan said he was just the case agent, as if that's some kind of distinction, and he tried very hard
Buchanan
to
was his
minimize,
boss, right?
minimize what he did. He spent most of his time in this investigation emulating the north end of a southbound horse. He sent hideous text messages that were very disrespectful of Miss Reed. He went through her phone looking for naked pictures. He used a slur for a mental disability to describe her. And it's obvious to anybody who looks at this objectively that he had made up his mind ever before he went to that crime scene, because he sent the text when that person said, are the Alberts going to get in trouble? He said, no, he's a Boston police officer too. So the idea that he was not essentially prejudging this from the get-go is out the window. So he was a state trooper. Because of some of the text messages that came in during the first trial.
And the other determination you came to was my client, Karen Reed, was a whack job cunt. Right?
Yes.
What else did you say in response to, she's hot at least? Or she hot at least, question mark.
So following that text, I responded, yeah, she's a babe. Weird Fall River accent, though. No ass.
The state trooper, I guess they call it the state police, fired him. And so in order to avoid his being there at the trial and having to admit, yeah, they fired me. Why? Because I'm a big jerk. They used Trooper Buchanan to come in and try and rescue him from what he had done. And I think it was actually worse for the prosecution that Buchanan was trying to say that he did this with integrity and honor, when it's very clear that looking for naked pictures of someone on a cell phone is not with integrity and honor. And neither is prejudging the investigation. I think
getting all that, first of all, he called her the see you next Tuesday.
Yeah.
And he did all of this hours after the murder. He had interviewed 3 people out of the dozens of people involved. He had not been to the crime scene, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
They had not secured the crime scene, et cetera. And he decided she was guilty at that point, and they never investigated any other possibility.
Nope. It's a classic rush to judgment case.
And then the bizarre thing, so he was in the first trial, and they made him read all that stuff he said, and it was extremely disturbing. And it resulted in this thing that never happens, which is a cop that not only gets fired, but gets publicly condemned by their department, saying that he brought, dishonor to this case.
Mm-hmm. And to the department.
Then you have his
whole.
boss. And here's what, again, I don't get, because, again, you've had time to think about this, you've had time to prepare. You have a bad guy. You have a guy who is officially, formally the bad guy. So what you do, if you have any brain cells whatsoever, is every bad thing about your case you put on that guy.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right.
Instead, his boss says he was perfect. He's one of the best people we ever had. He was excellent. Everything he did was was integrity and honor. And then he lets the defense go line by line and say, is that integrity? Is that honor?
Yeah. Well, and here's another thing about that. I think Buchanan, if he had had any smarts, would have said, I talked to him privately about some of his conduct, but eventually, when it came in the trial, the state had to let him go. And no, I don't think he acted with honor in sending those texts, but the information that he gathered was the information that he gathered, and it should be taken at face value. And that would have taken some of the sting out of it. And in addition to that, if Brennan had said something to the effect of, we had a bad state trooper in this case, but he got good evidence in the opening statement, it might have actually taken some of the sting out of all this. But still, I don't know how you sit through listening to those texts that he wrote and not come away with the idea that, he just prejudged this, rushed to judgment, and that was all there was.
And he was sharing confidential information about this case to his sister, who is completely tied in to all the other suspects and was feeding that information to them.
Yes.
And he agreed to accept a bribe.
Now that's
I don't know if
part of something I'm not
this is
aware
the
of.
first trial. So what happened is one of the women that his sister was involved in, who's in the Albert system, that person contacted him and said, or she told him, I'm sorry, his sister told him, they're so proud of what you're doing. when this case is done, they want to do something for you. They want to give you something. He said, oh, don't give it to me, give it to my wife. She suffered so much in this process. So he literally agreed to accept a bribe
Yeah, that's
from
exactly
people
right.
who were involved in the case.
From the people who are probably at fault in the case.
Yeah, we don't know what happened, but somebody.
Yeah. We know, we're pretty sure, I'm pretty sure it wasn't Karen Reed. I don't think she did anything to this guy. You know, the phone calls that they made such a big boohoo about in terms of, she was berating him and saying, what are you out? You're out having an affair with another woman, or that she sent on that, she called him on that night because he hadn't come home. You sure don't do that if you just run over him with your car. If you run over him with the car and now you're upset about it, you'd probably say something like, I'm really sorry I hit you with the car. But she didn't do any of that. And I don't think she's Mensa level smart enough to have thought, well, this would be a good way to deflect from what I did. I just don't think that's likely. And again, I think
The prosecution thinks
that
these
stuff
calls are
hurt
great.
the state more than it did her.
Oh, absolutely. Because, the prosecution thinks, oh, here's all these really nasty messages she left for him, and she called him names and all the rest of this.
At 12:58:19 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:58:47 a.m., the defendant calls John. It's not answered. 12:59:24 a.m., the defendant calls John. Voicemail number 3 is left with voice.
John, I'm here with your fucking kids. Nobody knows what the fuck you want, you fucking pervert.
And I've heard many people say that anyone listening to this, you're hearing a high-strung, drunk woman really, really pissed off because she can't figure out where her boyfriend is. And she already had a suspicion that he was sleeping around. And these phone calls are so passionate, nobody who had just run him over would make like 20 phone calls like this.
No, they wouldn't. If you'd actually run over him and you woke up and realized, holy cow, I just ran over him, you'd probably be leaving the jurisdiction for a while. Maybe go sun yourself in El Salvador or something.
So again, getting back to Buchanan, his boss, I just can't believe he's been like the most recent witness. Not only did he not distance himself from him, like you said, he could have said, this is all totally inappropriate. And I would have even, if I were him, I would have taken responsibility for firing him. I would have said, we fired him. This was unacceptable. But his investigative actions were legitimate, and we go with the evidence. But not only did he do all that, first of all, this is a senior officer who trains other people and oversees them, right?
Yeah.
And when the defense said, why didn't you locate the position that these taillight pieces were found in? And he said, well, we don't have all this sophisticated GPS technology and, we couldn't do it. And then the defense attorney says, well, what you do is you take a string and you tie it around one set place, like the flagpole, and you take another string and you tie it around something like the fire hydrant. Then you draw the strings together to where the piece of evidence is, you measure, and now you know exactly where it was. And Buchanan was like, oh, that sounds pretty good. It's just like when you're a senior officer.
Yeah. I would have to say that if it was up to me and they appointed me as the commandant of the Massachusetts State Police, I would ensure that I would assure that he got a T-shirt that says, I are a crime scene technician. Or, last week I couldn't even spell technician, now I are one. Something to that effect.
Right. And this, I think, just kills him with the jury. I mean, already, as we've said, he was refusing to answer anything. He totally delegitimized himself. But there is a text that Proctor sent to his colleagues and him, his boss, and his boss's boss. And in that one, he said, I'm looking through her phone. No nudes so far. His boss thumbs up that message.
Yeah.
Now Buchanan says, well, it was my Apple phone and I was just acknowledging. Like, nobody acknowledges
His
with a
Apple
thumbs
Watch.
up. I mean, yeah, yeah, you're right. Apple Watch, right? Yeah, nobody acknowledges with a thumbs up.
No. And they don't do it on,
And so
on a watch
then
if they do.
the attorney says, well, okay, you say you didn't see it, but when he said no nudes so far, what was he looking for? And he's like, I have no idea. It's like he's speaking Greek.
Yeah.
And the attorney even said, well, was he looking for motorcycles or boots? Or maybe nude pictures? And he's like, I have no idea. I couldn't possibly interpret this statement.
Yeah.
And I think that just killed him with the jury. If nothing else did, he was done.
Yeah. Well, this is going to be a really interesting case to follow, and I can't wait to get to the end of it, because I really believe she didn't do anything. I think she probably comes off as unlikable, and that's going to hurt her with the jury. I think this more recent stuff where they're trying to get in all of this bad character evidence is probably going to tarnish her a little bit. But
She was
they
trying to have an
not
affair
shown
in the middle
anything.
of this, you know.
Yeah. They have not shown, in my mind, anything approaching proof positive that she caused his death through hitting him with this car. And like I said, if she had hit him with that thing and it busted out the taillight, there'd be more than a few measly little scratches on his arm.
Yeah. Well, I come back to, I don't care about her, and I mean that in a constructive sense, which is I have no positive or negative reaction to her. I only care about the case. But I have noticed that it's the people who really dislike her who just immediately assume she's guilty.
Yeah.
And your risk here is you only need one person on the jury who has that reaction to her. And you at
Yeah.
least get back to mistrial. But a mistrial would be better than her being... It's hard to imagine even these people going for a third bite at the apple. But maybe they would. I don't know.
Well, if they do, somebody needs to step in and fix that problem. You know,
Can the feds or someone do that? Can they say this is just violating their rights? Or
not until after everything is over. I mean, if she got convicted and she lost her appeal in state court, she could file a federal habeas, and I think she'd get habeas relief based on all the different things that are wrong with this case. And based on the way the judge has handled this case, I think she'd get relief. But to me, the thing that really sort of seals the deal on all of this is if she had hit him with that vehicle, then there would be blood, and there were scratches on the man's arm, so there'd have to be blood on that taillight. And there wasn't any, there's no physical evidence that ties the SUV to O'Keefe or O'Keefe to the SUV, other than in the front passenger seat where he sat, right? Where you would expect there to be DNA. No DNA on that taillight, and no DNA on the taillight pieces, probably because somebody who put them there had gloves on.
right.
That's
And
what
so
I
the defense theory is that once they had the car in the Sallyport, which is the police garage, somebody, probably Proctor, broke up the taillight and took it back and put it down. And there's a number of and I want to say I am the most anti-conspiracy person. You know, I don't believe in conspiracies at all. So I have to see this kind of thing to really believe it. He lied about when he picked up the car, which then gave him the time to do that and bring taillight pieces back to the lawn. And that's the first time they found them, even though they'd already searched several times. Then you have that bizarre, we talked about, multi-week discovery of dozens and dozens of pieces.
Yeah. That doesn't.
So it's just, yeah.
One of the things that I found really interesting, I haven't really investigated it much, is there are people out there saying that they found two different shoes. That apparently he was wearing two different shoes, because they claim they found his shoes at the scene, but one of them shows a black bottom and one of them shows a white bottom.
Yeah, I don't know about that one. Some people have said it's just lighting or whatever. But it
We know
was
a little bit
used,
about
the
lighting. I
shoes
don't
were
think it's lighting.
used to say he was hit at high speed because they only found one shoe. But then again, they didn't account for the medical professionals taking off a shoe or having it with them, or or the shoe being in the house or anything, right? So
Yeah.
the idea that because he had one shoe, he was hit at high speed. Well, again, if you're hit at that high a speed that you come out of your shoes, there's going to be all sorts of other evidence.
Yeah, and all sorts of other trauma. A friend of ours several years ago was driving, he drove a milk truck for a dairy in Missouri, and he left at about 2 o'clock in the morning to go on his milk run, and he was coming up over the top of the hill where this drunk guy was meandering across the street, and he couldn't stop in time and hit the guy, and he knocked him out of his shoes. I mean, obviously, it was a lot more mass in a big milk truck, but I mean, that guy was a sack of broken bones. So none of this
Is there
makes
a reason?
any sense from a medical
Can you tell
point
me
of view.
this? I've been really confused about it. Which is, why can't they just bring in evidence that says, here's what dog bites look like on somebody, or here's what injuries look like on someone who was hit at this speed? I mean, they don't. So clearly, there's some prohibition against this.
Well, I'm not really sure why the defense hasn't hired an alternate medical examiner that they could get that information in with, because it should be within the purview of a medical examiner or a forensic pathologist to explain what kind of injuries you see in an automobile collision with a pedestrian, because clearly they would have seen that. But again, her application of Massachusetts' rather antiquated rules on expert witnesses, I don't understand how she's applying them. In federal court, that would clearly be allowed. So
Now, they did try to get it out of the troopers, but the troopers would just say, I can't remember. I can't remember any other accidents or what they looked like.
Yeah, I've never been to
and
another accident. Yeah.
Yeah, so of
We
course, if you
investigate
say I can't
accidents,
remember,
but I
there's
don't
nothing you can
remember
do
any of
about
them. Yeah.
it. Yeah. Now, I will say, and maybe it's a good way to kind of wrap this up. The medical examiner, normally you have two really, really key witnesses, and tell me if I'm wrong, right? You have your medical examiner who says it was homicide. You have your lead investigator who takes you all the way through the case.
Right.
And normally those are like first couple people you're going to talk to. Maybe you put a family member up front to humanize the whole thing.
Well,
The
usually
medical
what they'll
examiner
do
in
is
this
they'll
case-
put the investigator on first, have him run through the case, and then the medical examiner toward the end, so that you can show all the gruesome photographs and make the jury angry.
So in this case, the medical examiner in the first trial, we haven't heard from her yet here, said, can't determine it's a homicide, doesn't look like a car accident. Just on that basis, I would think you would not bring this case forward
Yes.
to the first trial. Now we go to the second trial. Not only do you have your medical examiner saying not a homicide, or I can't say it's a homicide, not a car accident, the lead investigator has been fired and dishonored for his work on this case, and they still bring it forward. This is what we're talking about with the Karen Reed case.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been a gross miscarriage of justice. She's lost her house. She's lost everything, that she's worked for her entire life, trying to defend herself, and her defense lawyers are now working for free.
Yeah.
I hope.
Well, and
there's
we can
good
say,
book
it's a
out of this.
victory if she's found innocent, but it's not, right? Her life
No.
has been ruined.
No,
She's
and
not
if-
in jail, but not a whole lot of difference.
Yeah. Unfortunately, she can't even sue for malicious prosecution because there was a probable cause determination. I think an erroneous probable cause determination, but a probable cause determination. And usually you can't sue if there was a probable cause determination. But this is clearly an anomaly. I would not ever want to be tried for anything in Massachusetts. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book called Pants On, Gun On, which is about concealed carry. And I told the story of a young woman whose first name was Rebecca. And she had a tumultuous relationship with her significant other, and he was going off and being angry and slapped her around a couple of times. So she ran downstairs with her kids down to the basement where there's like no other exit other than up the stairs where you just came from. And he told her he was going to come down and kill her children in front of her. And so she loaded up her rifle, and when he came down, prepared to do that, she shot him. One shot, immediately called for, medical care and all that. He wound up dying, and they charged her with voluntary manslaughter and convicted her for it in what was clearly an act of self-defense. And the thing that annoyed me the most about that is that they were offered the opportunity to change the law in Massachusetts, like almost every other jurisdiction around them had done, and they're like, no, we like our law. They honestly think that if it wasn't invented in Massachusetts, it probably doesn't need to exist. I think that's the way they look at it at the courts.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. Well, people, don't get pulled over in Massachusetts.
That's right. Yeah.
Anything else you would like to say about this?
Well, just that I'm hoping that the jury sees through the machinations of the prosecution on this, and I'll be following it right along with you.
Okay, well, thank you so much.